80,000 impressions later.
20 minutes later. 24 hours later. 48 hours later.
A few inches later.
A few minutes later. A few moments later. A little later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 8 hours later. And a flashback.
Eventually.
Flashback.
1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
2,000 years later.
2 very boring minutes later. 3 days later. 5 hours later. 5 minutes later. 7:59 a.m. 8 hours later. 10 seconds later. 15 minutes later.
Later that same evening.
Many hours later.
Meanwhile.
Moments later. More moments later. Much later. Much later. Much later.
1 eternity later.
1 hour later!
1 pair of pants later.
1 week later.
Several days later.
Several song-filled hours later. Soon after.
The following day.
The following Thursday. Yesterday.
2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later.
Day 2.
Day 3.
Day 4.
A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up.
Meanwhile, 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that
Party is shaping up. And a flashback. Soon after. Montage. Yesterday. Meanwhile.
Meanwhile,
Back in the Lola.
a few moments later.
Moments later.
Moments later.
More moments later.
Later.
Later. Later.
Later.
Later.
Later.
Later. In the void. Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later.
The following Thursday. Later that same evening.
Just then, by sheer coincidence.
12 o'clock midnight. 3:28 a.m.
7:59 a.m.
8:01 p.m.
10 seconds later.
12 seconds later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
Same evening. Several days later.
6 months later.
2 hours later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later.
4 to 6 weeks later. 1 pair of pants later.
8 hours later.
298 frozen patties later.
3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day, 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 3 days later. Opening night. Later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. Epilogue. Several song-filled hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 75 years later. 2 hours later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 2 very boring minutes later. 3 hours later. 1 winner later. The following day. Meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowland, 1 frozen wasteland later. 2 very boring minutes later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 11 minutes later. 15 minutes later. 20 minutes later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later. 2 hours 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 later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 5 hours later. 346 minutes later. 6 hours later. 6 hours later. 6.5 hours later. 7 hours later. 8 hours later. 8 hours later. Approximately 10 hours later. Several song-filled hours later. Many hours later. Many unbearable hours later. Marrow for sure. 24 hours later. 24 hours later. Early the next morning. 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 The next day. The next day. The next day. The following day. Tomorrow. The very next evening. Day 2. 48 hours later. 2 days later. Day 3. 72 hours later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later. Day 4. 4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. Several days later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 2 weeks later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 3 weeks later. 3 weeks later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 6 months later. Several months later. Many months later. 75 years later. 2,000 years later. 3,000 years later. 1 eternity later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab opening night, a lot of boring math later. Many tic-tacs later. 1 semester later. 1 debt to society later. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 long angry line later. 1 shift later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 1 winner later. 1 pair of pants later. 298 frozen patties later. Thousands of tears later. 1 hour later. 5 hours later. 2 days later. Later in the void. Approximately 10 hours later. Early the next morning. 1 shift later. 2 weeks later. 11 minutes later. 5 minutes later. A lot of boring math later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. 1 long angry line later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence. The next morning. Montage. The next morning. Many tic-tacs later. Flashback. End of flashback. 3,000 whoop-whoos later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few inches later.
Eventually, several bad puns later. Graduation day. Epilogue. Epilogue.
We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.
The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning. Moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. Later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later.
12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 2 hours later. Meanwhile. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time.